I'm KMO. I'm here at Politicon 2018, and I am with Dr. Brian Weeden, whose credentials I cannot rattle off from memory. So I'm going to look at my notes, and I'm going to say that he's the Director of Planning for the Secure World Foundation, where he specializes in space debris, global space situational awareness, space traffic management, protection of space assets, and space governance. Any one of those would be a fascinating, long conversation, and we won't get to all of them, I'm afraid. Although I think space debris is in the news, although a lot of people might not realize that it's in the news because it's been eclipsed by this very colorful concept of Space Force.
Yes.
How does Space Force relate to space debris? Maybe say just a little primer on what space debris is and why it's important.
Sure. So we've been launching stuff into space since Sputnik in 1957. And a lot of that stuff is still up there. At the moment, there are something on the order of 1,800 active functioning satellites in orbit around the Earth, along with something on the order of 23,000 pieces of debris bigger than a softball. The leftovers of all the stuff we put up there in the past.
So, again, 23,000 pieces.
And that's
a lot to keep track of.
And that's just the stuff bigger than a softball.
Yeah.
If you go down to, a centimeter or so, we're talking probably 500,000 pieces.
And these things are moving at a great rate of speed.
Yeah, the speed depends upon the altitude because they have to basically move forward to stay in orbit.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're talking at 400 kilometers where the space station is, they're moving about 7 kilometers a second, which is something on the order of 20,000 miles per hour. A little bit slower speed higher up, but yeah, they're moving pretty fast. So if they collide with something, you get a big boom and lots of additional space debris that then keeps flying around.
And there's the possibility that with enough stuff up there, colliding, breaking up, creating more stuff up there, you get something called Kessler Syndrome.
Yeah, so Don Kessler was a NASA scientist working on this issue back in the 1970s. And it's interesting, what he wrote about was that at some point we might have enough junk up there so that the collisions between the junk generates more new debris than what gets cleaned out by the atmosphere, and the population goes up. And that's actually happening. Keep in mind, though, that this is more like climate change than it is a nuclear reaction. Right? It's a slow process that takes place over decades, if not longer, that's gradually increasing the risk to orbiting in certain parts of space. And that's a problem, but it's not like we're going to lose it all tomorrow if something bad happens. Definitely something we need to think about because we got to worry about things like protecting the astronauts and keeping satellites from getting hit because we use those for a lot of really interesting stuff here on Earth.
Say more about that. I mean, I think a lot of people probably don't realize quite how much their lives depend on functioning satellites.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, sort of that invisible infrastructure, right, that supports a lot of what we do. So a couple of good examples. If you're watching a live sporting event from somewhere in the world, let's say the Olympics or the Super Bowl or the World Cup or something, odds are that television signal is being routed over satellites. So that's how we're going to get it broadcast around the world. If you wake up in the morning and check the weather, there's a really good probability that a big chunk of the weather forecast, the data that goes into that, is coming from satellites that are orbiting the Earth and monitoring what's going on. And when you pull out your phone and pull up Google Maps to go to navigate to somewhere, the signal that tells you where you are so you can navigate, GPS, is coming from a bunch of satellites. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole variety of ways that we use satellites every day, and it's not over exaggerating to say that our economy and global society basically runs on space and satellites. So it's just that they're invisible; we don't really see them a whole lot. So that's the biggest reason why I have to worry about space sustainability is we don't want to lose all those benefits.
Now, GPS, Global Positioning System, is something that it does more than just tell us where we are when we're using Google Maps. All manner of location-based services are dependent upon that. And it was initially a military project.
It still is a military project.
But it certainly has a wide variety of civilian applications now.
Absolutely. So it was started, the military basically needed a way to do two things. They needed to be able to synchronize time globally, and they needed to be able to have a good position fix so they can navigate and they can also guide aircraft and ships and planes and all kinds of stuff. And so that led to GPS. But not long after it was created, there was a realization there was also, as you point out, a whole bunch of civil benefits we could get from it. And so the U.S. government made a decision in the mid-1990s to make it officially a dual-use program where the Department of Transportation and the Department of Defense both have a say in running it, and we end up using it for a whole bunch of civil applications. And of course, what's happened since then is the number of non-military users using it has dwarfed the military users, even though it's still a very important system for the military.
Well, I'm bringing up military issues because obviously we're working around to Space Force at some point or another. But first, talk about the relationship or the dependence, you might say, of drones as the military uses them on satellites.
So over the last, say, 20 years, the U.S. military has put a lot of effort into integrating space capabilities into the way it fights wars and the way it projects power on Earth. So that includes everything from satellites that collect imagery and intelligence and do reconnaissance, to GPS, to satellite communications, and all of that is sort of exemplified in the case of UAVs, or as a public version as drones, which have been a big part of how the military has been fighting the war on terror the last 15 years or so. A lot of those UAVs are orbiting Afghanistan, Iraq, other places in the world, but they are being flown from the United States. There are pilots sitting in, rooms in Las Vegas and elsewhere, and the command signals are being routed over satellites. And those UAVs, mostly what they do is they watch at stuff, right? They have cameras on board, and they're taking imagery or they're running video feeds over very long, multiple hours worth of time. And those video feeds are getting routed around the world to different military installations using satellites. And there are some of them that are equipped with missiles that are used offensively to go try and attack things. And when they fire those missiles are being guided using GPS. And then when it's all over, they use other methods, either UAVs or some satellites, to fly over and see did they actually hit what they were supposed to get at. So UAVs are a very interesting example of how space is being used by the military every day to do stuff. And if you think of any other mission the military does, odds are there's a space component to it.
So, as you say, the U.S. military is heavily involved in space in a variety of ways right now. What the president has proposed has this provocative name, Space Force, and it conjures up images of maybe dressing soldiers up like Buck Rogers and sending them off into space to do play war games or something. But really, what he's talking about is an administrative reorganization of all of the things that are already going on.
That's absolutely right. This is a debate that's been going on for just about 20 years now. How should we organize our national security space activities? And by that, I mean the military space and then the intelligence space. Right now, the Air Force runs a big chunk of the military space. There's an organization called the National Reconnaissance Office that runs a big chunk of the intelligence space. And that's generally what happens, or how it works right now. But there's been challenges that have erupted, problems with that existing framework that has led people to wonder, should we do something new? And the Space Force is one specific answer to that, which says we should take all that stuff and move it into a totally separate branch of the military called the Department of the Space Force that would then go and just focus just on space. And that's what the president has directed the military to go do.
What are the supposed advantages of that reorganization?
Well, it's probably best to look at that from the criticisms of the current setup. One of the biggest criticisms is that a lot of it right now is being run by the U.S. Air Force, and their priority, not surprisingly, is Air Force and air power. So, for example, when the budget cuts hit after the 2013 Budget Control Act, popularly known as sequestration, it turns out the Air Force ended up applying those cuts more to space than to some of the aircraft programs. Right? They basically prioritized the aircraft over space. And then when there was some budget relief, again, a lot of the relief money went to beefing up air programs and not space programs. There's another challenge, which is that the way satellites operate in space, we know for its orbital mechanics, is very different from the way airplanes fly and from what most of us think about how physics works. For example, if there's an astronaut on the space station that throw a tennis ball, it's about 90 minutes later, the tennis ball is going to come back to about the same spot where he threw it from, because it's in orbit right alongside of it. It doesn't fly off into some other place. It doesn't deorbit. It just keeps going around, because that's orbital mechanics. So there's something else to be said, that if you have an organization primarily made of pilots and Air Force guys and women, they don't really understand space at the fundamental level. And so they might not always be doing the best things for space. So those are a couple of the challenges with the current setup. And so the thinking is, if you create a new organization, then it'll be able to focus on space. It'll be able to do some of the new things that military thinks need to be done to deal with some of the new threats. That'll be able to recruit and train people to focus space and be real space experts, and not just not just Air Force people that dabble in space occasionally. That's the thinking behind it.
Can you take the other side and criticize the proposal?
Oh, absolutely. Because I'm actually very much a critic of it.
Well, then you've done an excellent job of laying out the points of the other side. Yep. You've done an admirable job at not being a polemicist.
Thank you. The biggest problem with this is that it is an absolutely massive change from a bureaucratic institutional perspective. You're talking about moving around tens of thousands of people from the Air Force, but also from the Army and the Navy and the NRO and other places, and mashing them all together and changing things up and creating new organizations and new command structures, and there are millions of associated details with that. What's a uniform going to look like? What are they going to call the rank structures? That are, in my mind, going to be a huge distraction from actually fixing the problem, right? So one would think that if the problem is we need to fix how we buy satellites and we need to fix our training, our knowledge, why don't we just do that instead of spending 5-10 years or more changing the organization in the hope that at the end of that we can actually address some of these problems. To me, that's the biggest argument against this, is that it is hugely complicated, and the track record of the government getting big reorganizations right is not good.
So what's a more promising way of addressing the sort of myopia of the Air Force when it comes to space?
Well, that's the real challenge here, right? So one of the alternatives is something called a Space Corps, which would look a lot like the Marine Corps. So the Marines are a separate entity that exists within the Department of the Navy. They have their own culture, they have their own uniforms, they have their own commandant, but they rely on the Navy for a lot of the overhead functions. And that makes it a little bit leaner and a little bit more agile and flexible, able to do stuff. And so one of the alternatives is to create a Space Corps within the Air Force that would have a walled-off budget, that would get its own culture, but you wouldn't have to deal with things like, how they're going to have, who's going to do their medical services, what bases are they going to be located on, all this kind of, again, overhead stuff. The problem is that the Air Force really hasn't shown themselves to be a good steward, even after President Trump made the directive to go create a Space Force. The Air Force has done a lot of things to try and slow roll this, or to try and introduce a poison pill to try and kill it off, and just haven't demonstrated that they're recognizing that they need to change. So unfortunately, it looks like there's not really going to be a choice other than to do something separate, even though that's probably going to mean several years of confusion and lots of stuff probably getting screwed up before we actually get to the right answer.
When we talk about space, particularly with a military perspective in mind, it seems kind of strange to even call it space, because when I think of space, I think of the billions and billions of light years of vacuum in all directions. But really what we're interested in is the place where the atmosphere, or where the sky goes from being blue to being black, just this very, very nearby location.
Right. And as I mentioned, the U.S. has come a long ways in integrating space into all of the stuff it does here on Earth, right? So for the U.S., it's about how does it protect those space capabilities so that it can use space for its military. And we're not the only ones. Russia, China, Europe, India, many other countries are on the same path, and they're all developing their own military space capabilities. So the problem is, future wars, particularly against what we call a near-peer adversary, right, a Russia or a China, are probably going to involve space on both sides to some extent, which means both sides are probably going to be interested in trying to take out the other guy's space stuff and protect their own. And that is one of the big things that's driving this. For the last 17 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've been fighting against adversaries that really haven't had a lot of capability to reach out and touch our satellites or do a whole lot about it. I mean, there's some things they've done, but nothing like an organized state would have. So that's really underlying a big part of this, is as the military shifts towards thinking about future conflicts, which they've said they've decided is more likely going to involve a near-peer adversary like Russia or China, then that's probably going to involve space to as part of the conflict. And so how are we going to deal with that? And there's a lot of drive to try and get the reorganization piece done so we can prepare for that.
I think people are familiar with the concept of cyber warfare. And cyber warfare takes place between, as you would say, the near peers of the United States, particularly in people's minds right now, Russia. But at the same time, the same entities with whom we are having these contests in cyberspace, they are our trading partners. They are organizations with whom we have to coordinate in order to keep the business of daily life in 21st century Earth going on. So there has to be, and there clearly is, a possibility for competition tempered with cooperation. What do we have to look forward to in terms of a cooperative sphere above the Earth?
Well, and a lot of those same dynamics there in space. At the moment, we are partners with Russia in the International Space Station.
In fact, we can't send astronauts to space without Russia's help.
That is absolutely correct. Just recently, in the last week or so, there was another launch from on the Russian Soyuz, included a U.S. astronaut. They had a launch abort problem and thankfully got out okay. But ever since we ended the shuttle program, we've been relying on Russia to get our astronauts up to the space station. So absolutely, we are collaborating with them on that. When it comes to China, it's a little bit harder. There was a law passed in the U.S. several years ago that prohibits NASA or a couple other agencies from doing bilateral cooperation with China in space without getting permission from Congress first, which has been very much the turn to kind of doing that. But we've talked about, we're doing some scientific research with them, some type of cooperation. And there's a whole discussion going on right now about what is the future of human exploration going to be. There's a lot of talk going back to the moon with NASA building what they call the Lunar Gateway and potentially going back to the surface of the moon.
China has sent a probe to the surface of the moon.
China has sent a probe. They've got a whole series of probes going there. So there's a huge discussion right now about what is the next thing. It's probably going to be something involving the moon. And there's a sense from the U.S., from the Trump administration, we have to do this internationally. We can't afford to do it by ourselves. So that's an open question as to what the international cooperation looks like going forward on space, and whether or not it's going to include Russia and China in addition to Europe and Japan and Canada and many others. So yeah, it absolutely is a realm where we're both cooperating and competing. And the other big thing is the commercial sector.
Yep.
Over the last 15 years, commercial space has exploded in a good way. We're seeing not only the SpaceX's and the launching companies, but companies like Planet Labs that is now almost 200 satellites the size of a toaster that are imaging the entire Earth once a day. And that is providing a huge amount of data to support sustainable development, to kind of try and support agriculture and how we use resources. And there's billions of dollars in private capital flowing into space, tons of new investment. That is all going to yield a whole bunch of new ideas and innovations how we use space, more benefits. So you have this military competition, you have the exploration of the science, and you have the commercial all going at the same time. And how they interact it's complicated, and that's a huge part of what we need to think about with the whole Space Force is how do we keep that and a potential conflict from disrupting or destroying some of the other benefits we get.
So is keeping all of those factors in mind and thinking clearly about it what is meant by global space situational awareness?
So space situational awareness is a fancy term for figuring out what's going on in space and where's it all going. So keeping track of all the space debris, all the functional satellites, when they maneuver, when they change their orbits, are they going to collide or not? Space weather, because yes, there is weather in space, and how that impacts us. All of that is wrapped under space situational awareness. So for the military's perspective, SSA is a big part of how do we figure out what the threats are coming to a satellite and how to protect the satellite. For NASA, SSA is all about how do we protect the ISS and the astronauts from getting hit by a piece of debris. And for everybody, it's things like space weather and other things that kind of impact everyone. At the moment and historically, the biggest supplier of SSA data has been the U.S. military. But like in other places, there's a lot of commercial investment in that now. And so there's a big debate underway. Should we move part of that away from the military to a civil agency sort of like we have the FAA that does air traffic management? Should we have a civil agency that's got a version of air traffic control radars that are doing space traffic management? And what is the role for academia or industry to provide commercial data to support that? That's a big debate, been underway for several years. The Trump administration has actually published a policy back in June that gives the Department of Commerce authorities in this, and they started to move in that direction. But we're still waiting for Congress, who obviously has the final say on the budget and all that stuff, to whether or not they're going to approve that.
Well, that is a lot to keep in mind, and in all honesty, it is a deeper coverage of the topic than I think most people will be interested in. So let's pull back a little bit and dial down the complexity a little bit. What are the main points that somebody who is not thinking about these topics on a day-to-day basis, but they their attention has been caught by Trump, Space Force? What should they understand, which the mainstream media is not really providing for them?
So the big issues are that we have already had a lot of military space activities. Those have been going on for a long time, and the question is how best to organize those and how to do so in a way that doesn't jeopardize the scientific exploration, the human exploration, and the commercial developments in space. That's really the biggest issue to focus on.
And just on a non-space note, you're here at Politicon. Do you have any thoughts on just the political divisions or the representations of those divisions in our culture right now?
Well, one advantage of being a space guy is space is usually not a partisan issue, right? Usually NASA has pretty good support. Usually the space stuff that happens in the military is usually not all that controversial. And usually we also kind of exist off in the corner and nobody pays attention to us, right? In terms of the bigger discussion. And then Trump goes off and talks to the Space Force, and suddenly everybody cares about space. And everybody has an opinion on the Space Force. And, on one hand, I think that's good in that it's exposing these issues to more people than I think we normally get to them. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people that are either for the Space Force because they love Trump, or they're against it because they hate him.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that has added this polarizing element to the debate. And I don't know yet whether his involvement's been a good thing or not.
It's certainly got people talking about an issue that an issue that's very important,
right,
which is often ignored.
Right, and this age-old debate, is all publicity good, right? I don't know. Maybe it might turn out okay. Only time will tell.
Did he spell space correctly in his tweet?
Well, it'd be hard not to spell it correctly, or incorrectly, I think.
Well, Dr. Brian Weeden, it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Great to be here.